This is a recording for Biology 1407, the last unit and lesson in the course, Select Ecological Topics. There is no specific text reading assignment, also, though some of this material can be found in your textbook or in other free resources. But you can use this PowerPoint as both your study guide and reading assignment for this subject matter. All right, so the subject matter broadly is ecology, and that has to do with the relationship between living organisms and the environment around them, including other living organisms and non-living, what we call abiotic factors like soil, the atmosphere, water, salt, sunlight, things like that, non-living things, and also living things. The ecological units of importance, even though all of the interactions are between individuals and their environment, both living things and non-living things, most of our study of ecology looks at the effect of those interactions on populations, which are groups of individuals of a given species in close proximity to each other, entire species, of course, which represent all of the populations of creatures of a given type of creature that can successfully reproduce with each other, the standard biological definition of a species. And then all the different species interacting with each other as predator and prey, competitors, parasites and hosts, and all of those relationships, food and consumer. That is the ecological community. So that's the living organisms that a particular species and therefore a particular individual interacts with. That is this ecological community. And then if we add in the abiotic characteristics, so how much sunlight, temperature, what's the soil look like, how much water is flowing through, all of that that isn't alive, and combine that with the community, we get the ecosystem. So an ecosystem is a community plus non-living components. And then particular types of ecosystems, particularly large, widely distributed ecosystems, have certain characteristics. We're talking about deserts versus forests versus open ocean versus marine coastal communities and things like that. And all of those are different biomes. The word biome refers to that grand sort of level of organization of an ecological system, of an ecosystem. And so a tropical rainforest is a particular biome. The open ocean is another biome. And then the biosphere is simply the entire Earth with all of its biomes joined together, makes one large interconnected structure or system called a biosphere. Not really a structure, but a system. All right, first we want to take a look at some of the abiotic characteristics that determine where we have life on Earth, why we have life on Earth, where we have life on Earth, and how it is controlled by the abiotic situation. So let's go ahead and start with climate patterns because those end up setting a lot of the other stuff that we'll look at next in effect. So hopefully you're aware that climate and weather are different things. Weather is the particular event happening at a particular moment in a particular location. Sunlight, precipitation, cloudy, sunny, hot, cold, all that sort of stuff, wind speed, that's weather. If you average out the weather, what you see when you average year after year after year at a given location, that's what we call climate. And so climate is dictated by climate is driven primarily by solar energy input to the Earth. The main driver of climate, of all of the climatic processes, is solar energy striking the Earth. This does a number of different things. It moves the air about. We end up with circulation patterns in the atmosphere that are incredibly important to life on Earth. Differences in that solar energy input give us variations in climate for seasons and local variations. And then we have a number of different particular details that we're going to go ahead and take a look at within that idea. So I won't enumerate these right now. We'll get to them in time. But what we want to look at is how global climate is driven by solar energy to start with, and then we'll get down to these particular details. So of course the Earth is spherical, And the sun is also spherical, but at a great distance away from the Earth and also quite a bit larger. The relative diameter of the sun and the Earth are drastically asymmetrical, the Earth being quite a bit smaller. One of the results of this is that for all practical purposes, the light striking the Earth from the sun is all coming as parallel beams, striking all the Earth at roughly the same angle, relative to the sun coming from the sun. If we measured incredibly accurately, we'd see these rays are slightly diverging from left to right, originating in the sun way off to the left and striking the Earth. But the divergence is so minor that it's really not of a consequence as far as climactic effects. So, what's important to recognize right here is that at any point along the way here, we're getting the same amount of sunlight in the same amount of area, cross-sectional area, coming and striking the Earth. But because the Earth is spherical, that measured region, just this particular region of sunlight right here, is concentrated over a smaller surface area because it's perpendicular to the surface area right here than it is way up here at this extreme northern latitude or this extreme southern latitude right here, where the same amount of light is necessarily distributed over a larger surface area. So the result is more energy per square meter or square kilometer or hectare, whatever you want to say, on Earth. There's more energy hitting a square unit of surface area here where sunlight is perpendicular to the surface than here where sunlight is at a sharp angle relative to the surface. There's less heating of a given region here. So the result is something we know intuitively. As a generalization, the Earth is warmer at the equator because it is more successfully heated by sunlight and other components of the electromagnetic spectrum, but importantly sunlight right here. And the extreme northern and southern latitudes tend to be quite a bit cooler because they have a less concentrated beam of sunlight hitting them. So that sets up a temperature gradient from the equator to the poles. Higher temperatures on average at the equator, consistently lower temperatures at the poles. While we're looking at this photo, let's go ahead and talk about some of these lines. The globe is divided up into lines of latitude and longitude. Latitude are these lines right here. 60 degrees north is a measure of latitude, high latitudes, low latitudes. This is a high latitude, this is a lower latitude, this is the lowest latitude possible, 0, the equator. Longitudinal lines are going to run north to south, and that's a different thing and not important when talking about climate. That's not really relevant, but latitude certainly is. So the North Pole is 60 degrees north, 90 degrees north, the South Pole is 90 degrees south, and so on and so forth. These Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn lines have to do with the slide we'll look at in a minute, that show us how far north in the northern summer the sun will appear to be perpendicular over the surface of the Earth, and that's right here. So one way to imagine that would be to have these lines of light coming at an angle like this. Let's see if I can draw those real quick. All right, so what's happening is at summer solstice, the sun appears to be directly perpendicular. It's not working. Let's see. I wanted something other than yellow. Let me check my colors right here. Ink color, standard colors. Let's just do something contrasting right here. All right. So the idea is that we're going to have light coming in perpendicular to the Tropic of Cancer. That's as far north as the sun appears to be in the northern summer. And importantly, by the time we get down here, the sunlight's coming at a very, very sharp angle relative to the surface down here in northern summer. And so that's winter in the southern hemisphere and summer in the northern hemisphere. The Tropic of Capricorn illustrates the same phenomenon when we are looking at the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. The northern hemisphere people get to name all of these things, but it would be the summer solstice for the southern hemisphere. And there's the angle of light striking the surface from the sun. And so that's why you have long, dark nights up here in the northern hemisphere during the southern summer, and vice versa. So a little bit about those lines. The Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn represent the furthest excursions in north and south relative to the surface of the Earth of the sun. Please note, it's the Earth's movement that causes that, not the sun's movement. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this picture right here. So one of the consequences of that uneven heating of the Earth, more sunlight falling on the equator, running all the way up, north to the Tropic of Cancer in the north and the Tropic of Capricorn in the south. Did I get those right? Yeah. But anyway, more heating in that central region right here because, the sun is perpendicular to this surface, wandering up and down over the course of a year, but always heating this middle bit more dramatically, while the poles are heated less effectively. That sets up a very reliable circulation pattern of the atmosphere, and these are called convection cells. And that convection is when a fluid, either gases like the atmosphere, or water, like a boiling pot of water, or the oceans, or a lake, where that water flows due to differential heating. And as you know, hot air rises, hopefully you know this, and cool air tends to sink when you have them in the same place right here, because cool air is denser, and denser things will always end up underneath less dense things. Hot things are less dense, and so they rise. In a field of gravity, this works. You can't have very effective convection without a field of gravity. But in a gravity field, like on Earth, it works like a champ. And so what happens is the atmosphere breaks up into these circulating cells called convection cells right here. And not just one of them, but 3 sets of cells to the north and 3 sets of cells to the south. And notice how they interact right here. The next cell will be linked like a gear connected to this gear so that they flow in the same direction right here. And what we have is relatively cool, dry air falling and then spreading out over the surface of the planet right here. And we have warm, moist air rising right here and then spreading to the north and south. We have warm, moist air rising and spreading to the north and south. So the atmosphere consistently rotates in those cells, and those reach all the way around the planet. And then since the planet is spinning underneath all of this stuff, those wind patterns, instead of being straight north and straight south, get bent into these prevailing wind patterns called trade winds right here. The equatorial trade winds flow from east to west, and the temperate trade winds right up here flow from west to east, both in the northern and in the southern hemisphere. And then we've got a countercurrent further up here. And that's where the trade winds come. And what this does is, imagine it moves some heat energy up this way, falls, some of that can be driven this way, raised up this way, moved this way and that way. So we can have water and temperature moved in this system and technically go from the equator all the way up to the North Pole, or from the equator all the way to the South Pole through this interaction process. What this does is spreads heat energy out over the globe. In the absence of an atmosphere and these convection cells at work, we would have much higher average temperatures at the equator and much lower average temperatures at the poles. But because of this convection process, the energy is actually spread out much more evenly across Earth and makes more of Earth more habitable. Now, another important factor is, as this air is rising, as this air is heated up right here over especially water, the oceans around the equatorial region right here, it's bringing up a terrific amount of water with it, lots of evaporation, therefore lots of water vapor. And where the air is rising, it loses its water as pressure goes down as you go up higher into the atmosphere, and temperatures drop right here, so the atmosphere is getting cooler. That reduces the atmosphere's ability to hang on to water, and the water precipitates out as rainfall, classically around the equator and this tropical region right here. And this rain band is going to move north to the Tropic of Capricorn in the summer, and Cancer in the summer in the northern hemisphere, and the Tropic of Capricorn in summer in the southern hemisphere, November, December, January, February, that time. So this band is moving around the planet right here, but that explains, the wet tropics, our generally correct idea that the tropics are pretty wet because we get lots of rainfall. And even though the water is coming from the oceans, because the Earth is spinning underneath here, a lot of the rain ends up falling down on land. Then we have a relatively dry band at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, where cold air is falling from high up in the atmosphere and pounding into the surface of the Earth right here and spreading out. It doesn't have much water in it. And here we have very, very clear weather, very, very dry air, and this is around the planet where we'll typically have our deserts. As a generalization, you'll find deserts at about 30 north and 30 degrees south, varying up and down because of local features, and also diminished. They would be more extreme but for the fact that this entire system moves north and south over the course of a year because of the tilt of the Earth. Then we have another rain band, a remarkably, reliably wet area at about 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south. There's very little land at 60 degrees south to take advantage of this, but in the northern hemisphere, there's a lot of land at this band, and we have quite a bit of tall standing forests at the 60 degrees north rain band. And those few islands that are in the right location in the southern hemisphere get the same effect. And then at the poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, we have cold, dry air falling down from high above, clear weather, and again, a desert, a very, very cold desert, but importantly, very little precipitation. Red is going to represent lots of rainfall. Red is going to represent even more rainfall. Red is going to represent lots of rainfall. And, a very, very, a relatively hot desert, a relatively cold desert here and here. So those are some large-scale patterns that generate our climate around the Earth. So one of the things is, if we have a lot of water, typically we'll get to forests, we'll get to trees on land. But as the water becomes rarer and rarer and rarer, we move from trees to scrubby forests, from rainforests to dry forests to scrubby forests to grasslands increasingly, and then finally to deserts. Think about the desert southwest of the U.S., the desert northwest of Mexico, all this area right here, right under these dropping high pressure zones. This is a low pressure zone. Rising air creates low pressure. Low pressure is always associated with rain. Dropping air creates high pressure. High pressure is associated with clear, sunny days. And so we have a desert band right here. And then as we move north, it's getting moister again. And so we switch to grasslands, the central plains of North America. And as we work our way further north, we get coniferous forests in the west, and we get evergreen, deciduous forests, maple forests, and all that stuff in the east right here. But importantly, more and more forests in this area right here. Transitioning from scrubby forest to more, dramatic wet forest to, really, really massive forests up at this region right here. And then things dry off again. We get shrubbier. We end up with a grassland called taiga, called permafrost. There's another name for it I'm blanking on right now. But there's a northern and an extreme southern grassland community, which is frozen in the winters. And then finally we get to a point where there's no life possible. It's too cold. The water is always frozen, and that's, of course, polar regions. To explain the seasons, why the sun appears to be perpendicular over the southern hemisphere during, some portions, and, and that maximum movement south is the line of Capricorn, 23.5 degrees south. And then in the summer solstice, the line of Cancer, the Tropic of Cancer, at 23.5 degrees north from the equator, 23.5 degrees north. And so at that point, at summer solstice, 23.5 degrees north, the sun appears to be directly overhead to observers. And that's because as the Earth as the Earth proceeds around the sun here in its 360-day trip, while spinning once, every 24 hours, it appears, that the sun moves up and down, across the horizon from north to south. But that is an effect of the Earth's trip around the sun and not changes in the sun itself. Also, it's not warmer in the southern hemisphere because the southern hemisphere is closer to the sun. This picture gives you that idea, and the northern hemisphere is farther away. In absolute terms, if you measure that, it's true, but the difference is trivial. The distance between the sun and the Earth is so huge that that distance is just a tiny, 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 tiny fraction. It's incidence. It's the angle of light hitting the surface that drives temperature differences. All right. So just as the atmosphere is induced to begin circulating by differential heating of the oceans and the effect of wind on the surface of the oceans, which across an entire ocean, the effect of steady winds becomes really, really dramatic. We end up with ocean currents as well, which also distribute whatever is dissolved in that water and the energy in that water around the Earth, spreading it out quite a bit more than it might otherwise be. And these are convection circulation patterns of seawater. And this may look complicated, but we can kind of simplify it. And let's just take a look at the Atlantic Ocean for an example and recognize this pattern is true everywhere. At the equator, winds blow west sorry, east to west. They blow in this direction. Winds blow, let's see if I can get my little highlighter right here. We're going to have winds blowing in this direction. And so we drive surface waters in that direction. Well, water can't rise up and slosh over South America, so it's diverted north and it's diverted south by that process. And what happens is that equatorial water moves up along the eastern coast of North America. That equatorial water moves down the eastern coast of South America, taking warm equatorial water along those coastlines down. And then eventually that water, which is getting cooler and cooler, but still carrying a fair amount of temperature, rolls around right here, hits the European continent, the African continent, can't wash over them either. And so the bulk of it returns down here to replace the water that was blown west. And so we end up with this clockwise gyre. It's called a gyre. G-Y-R-E, I believe is correct. Clockwise gyre in the northern part of the Atlantic, and a counterclockwise or anti-clockwise gyre in the southern part of the Atlantic. When we look at the Pacific, it's the same thing. There's a northern gyre which circulates clockwise, a southern gyre which circulates anti-clockwise. If we look at the Indian Ocean, there is not much northern Indian Ocean. There is some of this going on, but there is a very substantial southern anti-clockwise gyre in the southern part of the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is mostly a southern hemisphere ocean. And then we have this consistent, because there's no land at the 60 degrees south mark right here, we have a roaring fast current hitting, consistently, winds and water, both moving from the west to the east consistently all the way around the world here. And so these are the water movement processes. So some consequences in here that might mean you might be familiar with. If you've traveled a lot around the world, or in the U.S., since we're here in America, if you've gone to Florida and gone into the water at this latitude right here, you'll find the water is relatively warm. At the exact same time of year, if you go over to Southern California, say LA or San Diego, and get in the water over here, you'll find it's freezing cold. Same latitude, same time of year. You can be here on Tuesday, get over there on Wednesday and jump in the water. And why? Well, on the western side of every continent, water's coming from the poles and washing along towards the equator. Western side of every continent. Eastern side of every continent, water is coming from the equator, generally washing, towards the north right here. So eastern seaboards are always more temperate and warmer, and western seaboards are inevitably colder. More water evaporates when it's warm, so we have more water in the air here for precipitation. That's why Western Europe is so dang green. And that's why the the Pacific Northwest is so green, because there's a terrific amount of water falling from this relatively warm water evaporating. It's cooling. It's getting colder and colder as it gets here, but it brings a lot of evaporative energy with it. And the same pattern holds all the way around the world. All right, now let's go and talk about more local effects that contribute to all of this as well. Ignoring global air movement patterns, inevitably, if you have an area that has land and water in proximity, like a coastline or the shore of a very large lake, you'll get this effect going on, which is when the sun is shining and the same amount of light is heating both the land and the water right here. Water, as you'll recall, has a very, very high heat capacity, so it stores a lot of thermal energy, while land doesn't. Wet land more, dry land less, but land inevitably less. So the air over land is going to heat up more quickly than the air over water, inevitably. And so that warmer air is going to rise preferentially over land and start setting up this cycle right here. And this is why when you go to the beach, almost anywhere on Earth, especially on a on a hot day, you'll get this steady offshore breeze blowing from the ocean onto the beach and then over land right here. And that offshore breeze will be relatively cool, and it'll get hot really quick as we move further and further away from the coastline right here. While the beach, although maybe quite hot because of sunshine, the air temperature is usually a little lower because of this offshore breeze. At night, The exact opposite will occur. When we turn off the lights, the ground, the dry land is going to cool down much more rapidly than this body of water out here. So at night, it's a onshore breeze blowing out over the oceans. So if you sit on the beach at night, then the mosquitoes come. But in the day, the offshore breeze keeps the mosquitoes off of you if you're really close to the water's edge. If you're inland a little ways, you're out of luck. I'm talking about the Texas coast. But so, some examples of how these things work. Some other really, really important things. This is, you may not recognize it, but this is California. There's the coastal California, there's the coastal Rockies Range, which is, a modest set of mountains right here. The famous Central Valley, where all of the produce is produced in California, all the growing. And then the major Rockies, these are the big ones right here, the Cascade Range, the serious Rocky Mountains right here. And if we have a wind blowing over a mountain, we have this thing called orographic precipitation. And that's where as air is pushed up, it gets colder and air pressure drops. Same idea as this right here, although what's driving this right here is the sunlight from differences in sunlight. Here, it's mechanical. We've got a wind blowing and there's a mountain in the way, and so inevitably the air has to be blown up over the top. And what happens is as it rises up here, the air tends to lose its ability to hold water. So we classically have rain over on this side right here. If these mountains are minor, we'll have a little bit of rain going on right here. And that is exactly what happens in the coastal and the Cascade ranges. In the Cascade Range, the air is lifted quite a bit higher. Really all of the precipitation available in the air is lost, and as that water becomes, goes back to a liquid from its gaseous state, we have these clouds up here, and then we have all this precipitation, and the water collects in the Central Valley and also washes over the Pacific coastal plains right here of California. And what air makes it across the Cascade Range into Death Valley, for instance, is extremely dry, and hence another reason we'll have a desert over here. And this is called the rain shadow effect. And inevitably, whichever way the winds blow, if they blow reliably in one direction, one side of a mountain will be green, the side that is windward, facing the wind, and the side of the mountain that is hidden from the wind, the lee side of the mountain, will inevitably be dry. So I've just opened up Google Earth right here, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Earth right here. And here's the California situation. Let me see if I can zoom in on that really quickly and show you these rain shadow effects in California. There's the Central Valley. Okay, all we want is geography right now. So here's the Central Valley. There's the coastal Rockies. There's the Cascade Range, the main, this main part of the California Rockies right here. So, there's low mountains here, high mountains right here, and the Central Valley in between here, and very, very dry off to the east of the coastal Rockies here. Okay. Let's take a look at another place everybody loves. If I can find it. Yes. So here we are in, not supposed to have any labels. Why do I still have labels? Okay. I've done some field work and teaching work out here, and I've got labels still left on it. So here we're looking at, and hopefully the Hawaiian Islands are all mountainous. They're volcanic mountainous islands. So this is two great big volcanoes right here. And if you check the weather, you'll find that the wind is typically blowing from the northeast in this particular case because of the rain shadow effect. Here's the peak, here's the top of the mountains right here. The northeast side is green, the southwest side is relatively dry and barren. This island right here is completely blocked by this island right here, so it doesn't get any measurable rain. It's extremely, extremely dry. And the process repeats itself. This is Kauai right here, which is an older island, a bit more beaten down and low, but this is the dry, relatively dry southwest side, and this is the much lesser, wetter northeast side. Let's just check that assumption. I pulled up the National Weather Service and clicked on Honolulu, Hawaii, which is on the island of Oahu in the middle of the map we were looking at a minute ago, and just took a shot at it. And the wind is indeed 15 miles an hour coming from the east. In case you know, the wind is always the direction they give here is where it's coming from, not which way it's blowing to, but where it's coming from. So the wind is coming from the east. Let's go and find Honolulu. It's going to be and here's the eastern side. Here's the eastern side. Wind from the east. Hopefully that made that clear to you. All right, so that's the rain shadow effect at work. All right, so that's a little bit about climate. Now let's talk about things that the movement of water and some deeper processes do that moves mineral resources around the planet. The Earth is considered geologically alive, as opposed to Mars, which is for the most part geologically dead, or the Moon, which is geologically dead. And what they mean by alive and dead is a geological cycle is at work on Earth, and that cycle importantly moves energy from the core to the surface and matter to the surface. And then we have a process that recycles matter on the surface, takes it back into the core of the planet, and that cycling continues over geological time. Earth is a living planet because its surface is constantly consumed and taken into the core of the planet, and new surface is continuously produced. That's why it's very hard to find old fossils from far, far back in time, because the old geological deposits are hard to find because most of them have been consumed and recycled, and the fossils, of course, would be lost. So what we're talking about is something called global, and I'll start with geochemical cycles. That's just the movement of matter on the surface of the Earth. And there are these geochemical cycles. There's a ground one, which is the tectonic cycle, and then closely allied to it is the water, or highly interacting with it is the water cycle. And those are the two big geochemical cycles that move matter around on the surface of the planet. And then we also have living organisms which put their thumbprint, as it were, on these cycles and change them. Because of biological processes, we've got elements appearing in places on Earth where they would not if we just relied on geochemical cycles. The most dramatic example of that is the tremendous presence of oxygen in the atmosphere. Geochemical processes, along with tectonics, would take all of that oxygen out of the atmosphere and bind it up permanently. And we'd have a very low level of oxygen in the atmosphere, but it's the biological part that makes so much oxygen available in the atmosphere. And conversely, strictly due to geochemical cycles, all of the nitrogen on Earth is going to be, primarily because of the nature of the nitrogen atom and molecule, is going to be in the form of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, and very little anywhere else. But because of biochemical cycles, lots and lots of nitrogen is included in soil, dissolved in water, and that is because of the activity of living organisms. So on a grand and measurable at a planetary scale, living organisms affect geochemical cycles. And that's why we say biogeochemical cycles. We want to look at a few right here: the water cycle, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen as exemplars of processes that move all the mineral nutrients of interest in biology. All right, so let's take a look at the tectonic cycle without getting too terribly detailed about it, but these are the important ideas right here. So we'll start with what you're probably most familiar with. On the surface of the planet, we have erosion. We have wind and water and chemical and sunlight all breaking down rock slowly over time. I think everybody will agree with that. Water, light energy, UV radiation, wind, blowing bits of sand around, abrading other surfaces, and freezing and thawing in cold places all break down the surface material right here. And aquatic processes, the flow of water over the surface due to precipitation, due to rain, inevitably moves that material back into bodies of water, ultimately into the oceans. Downhill is always into the oceans. From erosion on land, the destination is inevitably the oceans. Stuff may get stopped along the way for a short period of time or millions of years, but given enough time, everything makes it to the oceans in the form of erosion, the results of erosion. And, excuse me about that. And then once those materials are in seawater, there's lots of chemical processes that cause, minerals to precipitate out. And this doesn't involve any life yet, but minerals to precipitate out and form a layer of sedimentary material piling up in seawater. Ultimately, this is going to be limestone. This is how limestone is produced. There are strictly geochemical processes that precipitate out calcium carbonate, which contains calcium, oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. All of those elements are in that one compound, forming up the seafloor right here. Okay, well, if that's all that was happening, all of those materials that were the products of erosion would accumulate as sediments in the seas until the seas were completely full of that material. This layer got thicker and thicker. But it's not static. The sea bed is inevitably being subducted, not everywhere around the planet, but every seabed has at least one margin that's being subducted. And that means it's complicated, but the continental plates are sliding up over the ocean plates. The ocean plates are thinner, so they're naturally pushed under, and the sea floor is pulled down into the hot mantle of the planet and broken up and boiled, first boiled and then actually melted, and then such high temperatures that we even start ionizing things and, changing, not elements, but, changing chemical compositions of things. Limestone gets metamorphosized into marble as we work our way down along this line right here. The more volatile materials, including water and carbon dioxide and some other gases and some sulfur compounds and things like that, are all boiled out of this stuff as it gets hotter and hotter under higher pressure, and then rises along with, liquid molten material back up through the crust through a crack somewhere, and then is released onto the surface as volcanic activity. Heavier elements will be out in the form of lava. The lighter elements will be the gases coming out of the volcano, which is rich in water, CO2, and sulfur-containing compounds, sulfur and hydrogen. And that's the tectonic cycle in a nutshell. The ocean floors are constantly recycled under, and then new surface material is produced via volcanic activity on land, on continents, and also in mid-ocean ridges, MORB. I don't know what the B is right here, but mid-ocean ridges is what this means right here. And we have volcanoes, for instance, running all the way north to south through the center of the Atlantic Ocean, and we're creating more seafloor there through volcanic eruptions right here. And those volcanoes are introducing fresh materials to the surface right here that can be used by biogeochemical cycles, releasing gases into the water right here that are now available. Same thing as is happening on land. So that's the tectonic cycle. And that recycles the surface of the planet, most importantly. Almost all of it's been replaced at least once since the origin of the Earth, and much of it multiple times. All right. So if we superimpose on that tectonic cycle, the hydrological cycle, and this sounds complicated, but all we really want to, let's take a look at this picture right here. The hydrological cycle is the result of solar energy. Solar energy causes water to evaporate wherever it is. Water evaporates from wet soil and from plants via transpiration. It evaporates from, bodies of water on land. But most importantly, since the great bulk of the planet is ocean, the surface, of the planet is ocean, most of this evaporation comes from the oceans. And so we get water in the atmosphere, which has some interesting greenhouse effects. And a lot of that water, of course, falls back down as rain into the oceans. But importantly in this conversation, lots of it also falls on land. And it's not going to stay there. It's going to percolate along the surface through surface waters. It's going to percolate subsurface through groundwater and work its way back to the oceans. And when it falls, it's fresh, clear water because only water evaporates. Salts don't evaporate. Phosphorus doesn't evaporate. Sulfur doesn't evaporate. Those compounds stay in the water right here, sodium and potassium and magnesium. And so then this water picks up a tiny amount of those salts. So every river system, if we go to the source of the river, it's going to be fresh, perfectly pure water. By the time we get to New Orleans and the end of the Mississippi River, it's surprisingly salty. It's still considered fresh water from a biological standpoint. You can still drink it. From a salt standpoint, I wouldn't drink the water in the Mississippi at New Orleans. It's going to have way too much industrial pollution. But the saltiness is not a problem for you. But it does get saltier. And so the water evaporates from the oceans again after this water runs into the oceans. And so what happens is minerals accumulate in the oceans, right? So as a fact, it is a fact, the oceans have been getting saltier over geological time, and they will continue to do so because there's a greater dumping of dissolved salts into the ocean than there is removal of salts via subduction. Now, plenty of salt does get subducted, and so sodium and potassium and other elements like that end up in this plume of stuff rising back up to the surface, or rising up to the surface of these mid-Atlantic, these oceanic volcanoes. But the volcanic activity brings it back up to the surface. And just for the record, occasionally seabed is also lifted up directly onto land because of changes in continental and seabed structures. That's why here in Texas we're standing on old seabed, fossilized seabed, the limestone that North Texas is famous for. Anyway, so we're constantly moving more minerals into the oceans, and so one fact you should know is over geological time the oceans are getting salty. They started off fresh, technically. All right. So we're going to show you the carbon cycle next, but that's representative of all biogeochemical cycles. So that could apply to oxygen, to nitrogen, to sulfur, to phosphorus, to sodium, to whatever you wanted. And in all cases, we can simplify that cycle and think about 4 compartments. And those 4 compartments are 2 that are organic, so 2 organic compartments, and 2 inorganic compartments, so that's 4 of them. And then one of those organic and one of those inorganic are what are called slow cycling. An element in that particular compartment is going to stay there for a really long time, And then one each of organic and inorganic fast compartments, the element can be moved from one chemical form to another, and enter or leave these compartments rather rapidly, fast cycling. All right. So for instance, when we're talking about carbon, which is the next slide we'll look at, if you look on Earth, the vast bulk of carbon on Earth is in the form of rocks. It is in the lithosphere, and that is inorganic, and that stuff is very slow to move. Think about limestone, think about marble. Even granite has some carbon in it, but the sedimentary rocks are rich in carbon because of calcium carbonate. And that's an inorganic, slow cycling portion. Now, when limestone is exposed to the surface, it's going to be eroded by water and acid chemistry and wind and light, whatever, and so it'll be slowly moved from this compartment over to this compartment, dissolved in water and moving around. To this compartment right here, dissolved in water and moving around quickly. Or in the case of carbon, also released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, or carbon dioxide and water. And so that's the fast inorganic cycling part right there. And then, as you all know, living organisms can take that carbon and pull it into their tissues, plants and animals, via the food chain and via photosynthetic processes. And that's the organic fast cycling process. Carbon can move in and out of living things very, very rapidly as they live and die. From a geological perspective, this is just a flash a second. And then a lot of that organic matter can get caught and trapped as fossilized material that is still organic. And that, of course, is our fossil fuel deposits all over the place. Coal and oil and natural gas. And, I just can't think of these sedimentary rock I'm trying to think of that has lots of coal. Shale, which is a big deal in shale oil extraction right now. But those are all organic, fossilized organic material. And of course, that's what we're digging into right now. And we're altering the geochemical cycle. We're altering the, and I should say biogeochemical cycle right here, because living. But we're altering that cycle by moving lots and lots of carbon from this compartment, which is normally very slow, to this compartment. Lots of it moving here. And we're also destroying lots of living stuff on Earth, particularly plant matter, and moving all of that stuff to this compartment right here. And as you know, carbon has, even though it's a small concentration, has a very dramatic effect on the behavior of the atmosphere. All right. So here's an illustration of that carbon cycle. And so, here's the fast inorganic compartment. And then of these living things on land and matter, that's the fast organic compartment. CO2 in the atmosphere, fast inorganic. CO2 in the lithosphere, slow inorganic. CO2 included in coal and oil and other organic fossilized material. That's the organic and slow. And if we look at the oxygen cycle, we've got a similar sort of thing going on. There's quite a bit of oxygen. In fact, the bulk of oxygen on the planet is contained in the lithosphere in oxides of various sorts. So lots and lots of material in the crust of the Earth has oxygen, and that's where the bulk of it is. But then we have a substantial amount that is present in the oxygen form due to photosynthesis. Notice 38 million metric, 10 to the 12th moles per year. So a stupendously large number. But notice, the bulk of oxygen production is sorry about that, I just can't seem to shake this cough. The bulk of oxygen production is on land, and a slightly smaller amount comes collectively from all the oceans of the world. So even though land makes up a small part of the surface of the planet compared to the oceans, the bulk of photosynthetic activities on land. And under normal conditions, these processes are balanced by respiratory processes that take oxygen out of the atmosphere and release CO2. So here's the oxygen cycle, and these processes are balanced typically right here. And then we also have geochemical processes, oxidation of exposed minerals on the surface. Iron gets oxidized into iron oxide, turns red right here. That doesn't require any living things. So there is a fast chemical inorganic component, a slow inorganic component, a fast inorganic component, and a fast organic component all in here. All four compartments are represented for the oxygen cycle. Similarly for the nitrogen cycle. We'll take a little bit of a closer look here because just as an example of how complicated and important these can get. Hopefully you'll recall that, I've certainly said it a lot in class, that nitrogen is a key component of all living organisms, but very, very hard to get at. And that's because most of the nitrogen in the atmosphere is in the form of the N2 molecule, which is not water soluble, and it's in the atmosphere. The bulk of atmosphere is nitrogen, and there's very little nitrogen anywhere else on Earth. So there are bacteria. There are inorganic processes that make soluble nitrogen, lightning and volcanic activities being the two big ones. So when you have a whole lot of energy, you can make rare, chemical compounds, but they're rare. But bacteria living in large amounts, produce a terrific amount of nitrogen fixation where they take atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into a soluble form, and that is ammonia. And then ammonia can be converted into nitrite, NO2, and nitrite can be converted into nitrate, NO3. And these are all soluble, and these are all available for plants to use, and therefore, by extension, by eating plants for animals to use, etc., etc. The bacteria do it themselves in order to get nitrogen to make proteins and nucleic acids, and then these bacteria extract energy that was present in ammonia and convert it into nitrate. These bacteria take the energy present in nitrite and extract it, making nitrate. And then there are some denitrifying bacteria that take any of these things and turn them back to N2 gas, extracting energy from them. So it's kind of a complicated bacterial ecology as well that all other life is plugged into by taking advantage of what these guys are doing, which is making soluble nitrogen available. Now, any decaying organic matter has proteins and DNA in it, and so ammonia can be released from those things, but eventually it'll all end up back in the atmosphere unless nitrogen fixation captures it again. Lightning and volcanoes do create soluble nitrogen, but those are neither predictable, dependable, or particularly vast on a global scale. So here we're looking at the nitrogen cycle. So atmospheric nitrogen is pulled in by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, either the ones that live as co-symbionts of beams and their relations, or just the free-living nitrogen-fixing soil bacteria. Don't forget about cyanobacteria. They also do this, so they kind of have a role like this, but they're photosynthetic. And all of them make ammonia. All right. And then that ammonia ends up being used by plants, or the nitrates or the nitrites. nitrites or the nitrates. Any of these three can be used by plants and assimilated, to make plant proteins and plant nucleic acids. And then, of course, animals are going to eat that stuff. The feces from the animals, the shed skin, the shed fur, the dead bodies, all will be decomposed by decomposing bacteria and fungi, and ultimately release that ammonia, that's the ammonium that's a part of each amino acid. These guys will use those for themselves, but there's lots left over that can be used by everything else. And so here's that cycle. It's a terrific cycle, terrific big cycle right here, and we're utterly dependent on it. You take these off the planet, and all life will die. If you get rid of these, there will be, it would destroy everything. So we're utterly dependent, you and I, personally, on nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Either the cyanobacteria, which are perhaps the one organism that can live in the absence of any other organism on Earth. That's cyanobacteria. They're the most self-sufficient living thing on Earth. Everything else is dependent on something else. This is a heterotrophic bacteria, so it's dependent on something making sugars that it can, eat. It's going to be one of these guys. All right. Humans, of course, have had a huge effect on all of this process. So just as an example right here, we'll talk about nitrogen. If you're not aware of it, the primary component of fertilizer and the main thing that we're delivering in fertilizer is soluble nitrogen, because that's the hard thing to get to plants. Now, fertilizer also has phosphorus and sulfur and potassium and other things like that that are important, but it's the nitrogen that's the big one. And so what we do is, when we do agricultural work where we grow crops and then strip those crops out of the soil and ship them to the other side of the continent, we're pulling nitrogen out of the soil and not replacing it. So the soil becomes nitrogen poor. Thus, we have to add nitrogen back as a fertilizer in order to replenish what's been lost through this lack of a cycle right here. Now, if we, raised our food, ate it locally, consumed it locally, dumped the debris locally, from all of that, including feces and everything, back where the food was being produced, we kind of close the cycle and recycle nitrogen, but that's not happening. Agriculture doesn't do that. So we have to, continuously subsidize the process. But of course, the flip side is, we mass-produce agricultural products right here. But the problem is we inevitably deplete soil. We deplete the mineral nutrients of soil, including nitrogen, which again is the hardest one to replace. So we use a terrific amount of energy from petrochemicals to produce soluble nitrogen fertilizers. Here we are spraying some on some crops. Hopefully you're familiar with this image right here. It's the way the world is set up. This is necessary, but it has some serious downsides, which is we're burning a huge amount of energy to make all of this happen. Where does that energy come from? Most typically fossil fuels. We're changing a little bit now as we alter our energy source system. Inevitably, when we do this, we're going to have runoff. All right. So this is Louisiana. This is the Texas coast right here, and this is the Mississippi Delta. And the Mississippi is draining. Here's the Mississippi coming along and then punching through Louisiana right here. The Mississippi drains a huge chunk of North America, and a huge amount of that chunk of North America is prime agricultural territory. And all over that area, we do this. We add a whole lot of fertilizer because we want to get lots of crops growing really quickly, and then it rains. And so what happens is that fertilizer runs down through rivers, gets into groundwater, and works its way down to the oceans, because the direction, downhill for everything is towards the oceans. And so what happens right here is in the summer, which is after these spring rains and after the spring plantings and fertilizings, we get a terrific increase in nitrogen and other nutrients accumulating in the Gulf of Mexico here from all of these rivers, but primarily the Mississippi. And that leads to a huge bloom in algae, which like fertilizer, and those algae grow in huge numbers very, very rapidly, then all die off once they've consumed all of the fertilizer, and then their decomposing bodies draw down the oxygen content of the water, and we have a gigantic dead zone right here. And each year there's a huge chunk of coastal Gulf of Mexico that becomes inhospitable to life because of the excess agricultural runoff going into that body of water. Sewer systems, taking waste, from cities, polluted rivers, from sewer systems, would have a very similar effect. The same sort of thing happens where, municipal waste is introduced into bodies of water. You get huge algal blooms followed by death of everything. Not a good thing. And this isn't just the Mississippi. It happens all over the world wherever this situation is repeated. A big river and a large agricultural land associated with it, and resource-intensive factory farming. All right, we're going to go ahead and call this a recording, and I'll post this, and then we're going to move on to biomes and ecological interactions.